Hi, everybody. Welcome to No Country. My name is J. David Osborne. That is Kris Sacknessum. Chris, how are you doing today?
Good, David, and I'm proud to be saying I'm wearing pants for this episode.
You're wearing pants?
Yep.
Well, I am not wearing a shirt. So between the two of us, if you weren't wearing pants, we'd have one fully clothed human being. But one and a half's not bad. Chris, on our last episode, we kind of freestyled it. We did a little car talk, which I think was fun, but we decided that we wanted to get back to the kind of novel-like progression of ideas that we had started in Butterfly in Your Mouth and continued up through Needle Nose Pliers. So I thought, we thought rather, during our pre-game discussion that I would just kind of start off with what's going on in my life right now, which, as you know, I moved into a new house recently, and there's just been a sort of ship of Theseus deal going on where I'm painting everything, I'm replacing things. I took out the lights that were hanging up and replaced them with fans and new bulbs. And I was thinking to myself, now it feels more like my place.
Right.
Does that make sense? Does that make sense
absolutely.
to you?
That's like revision in writing, You gotta get your hands dirty.
Yeah, and I think that this place in particular, the previous owners, great people, they were very much into cycling. When I came into the house, when they still had all of their stuff here, there were about 5 bikes hanging from the ceiling. And so that left some rather unsightly tire marks on the walls. And I've been looking at those tire marks for the past month, going into an obsessive compulsive frenzy about them. And so I finally painted over them today, and it felt so good to paint over those tire marks.
If only if you could paint over all of the tire marks, the psychic tire marks in our lives, right? I think that's one of the reasons why painting is so satisfying.
Oh, I agree with that. And I think that some people do try to paint over it. That's when you have people who get addicted to Xanax and things like that. People who want to be numb to the world. I think that that's basically what they're doing. But the problem is that it tends to bleed through every single time.
Yeah. Well, yeah, that's kind of a superficial paint job. It's not really thinking it through.
Yeah.
Where in the progress, picture are you? Are you?
No, I'm still working away. I got my office done. I got half of the living room done today. I'm a maniac who sort of tapes as he goes. I don't like to do the taping all at once. That's also how I write. I can't sit down and do any one thing. So my novels are usually written sort of on the fly, where I will outline them a chapter at a time. There's a great quote from, oh gosh, I'm missing the name now. You might know who said this. But a person once said that writing a novel is like driving through the desert with your headlights on. You can only see about 100 feet at a time, but you can make the whole trip that way. And that's pretty much how I write. I forget who said that. It's going to bother me.
Yeah, it's going to bother me too.
Yeah, well, you're welcome. But yeah, have you ever done any renovations on your places?
The first house I ever owned, I was about your age, and it was the cheapest house on a very pretty street in a rural town in Australia that had 2 main sources of employment, a bacon factory and a prison. And as people know who have ever lived in a prison town, they attract a group of, basically people servicing the drug needs of prisons. And the house I bought had been inhabited by drug dealers who left it absolutely trashed. So there was just weeks of butt-sweating work to be done, pulling out, terrible, damp, burnt carpet, just foul-smelling stuff. And it took me, I just was working so hard to get finally to the painting stage. And, I just was so proud when I finally finished. And I finished in the living room, and I just collapsed on the floor, exhausted. But I thought to myself, well, here I am. I'm a homeowner. I've made it. I'm a citizen of the world now. And this is my house. And I looked up at the ceiling, and just down from the roof, where I'd also just put in a whole bunch of insulation, came this enormous huntsman spider. And, they're the size of your hand. And
oh, yeah, I've seen them online.
The folklore is that when they appear like in the kitchen, which is where they often do, it's going to rain very soon. But I looked up at this spider and I thought to myself, this isn't really just my house. This is having your name on some title or deed, really doesn't mean anything. And here was an outsider artist, this beautiful spider. And I'm not a big fan of spiders, but I dig these ones, because they're symmetrical and just look, cool. And they're also not dangerous. Mm-hmm. And it was just a reminder that, we're not really owners of anything. We're just all passing through, all travelers, know.
Oh, yeah. Well, I mean, that reminds me of the house next door, which is completely condemned and is set to be demoed soon. Used to be a very beautiful house, you can tell, but the years have not been kind, and a lot of it was boarded up. And I think that the person who bought it thought that he was going to be able to flip it and sell it, and the city came by and said, "You are absolutely not going to flip this house. It's got to be torn down." So there's this empty house, and a few nights ago, I was putting in blinds, and I noticed this teenage boy riding his bike into the backyard, setting his bike down, got a backwards baseball cap on, and I saw him go in through a hole in the house. And I thought to myself, well, that's kind of dangerous. I don't know if he should be doing that, but I stick to the Oklahoma adage of minding my own damn business.
Good for you.
So I went back and minded my own damn business. And then later on that night, he had brought his friends back, and they were going to town on this thing, smashing out windows, kicking out the siding of the house, all this kind of stuff. And so I let the owner of the house know, and he said, well, it's going to be demoed anyway. And I thought, oh, I wonder if he's liable, if they hurt themselves. But again, mind my own business. And I got to say, a bunch of neighborhood kids over the past day or so have made their way to this house, and it's just kind of nice to see kids doing kid stuff again. Can you imagine being that age and finding out there's an abandoned house where you can take a Louisville Slugger to Windows with no consequence?
Yeah.
I mean, it was great. No screens, not a cell phone in sight, no Xbox, no nothing, just kids being kids. And there was something kind of nice about it. I don't think anybody got hurt. Hopefully not. So anyhow.
Wow. It makes me think it would be sort of cool to plant a little, a mini camera in there and kind of film like the secret life of this doomed house, these last sort of hauntings of young people. Because they're kind of, psychologically, I think they're trying to reclaim something of the spirit of that house, which, that is sort of a cool thing. I don't read that as vandalism. Exactly. I'm not dismissing the vandalism side, but I can relate to some sort of ceremonial, thing going on,
Well, it's kind of nice for the house. It has residents for the last time, and it's kind of like a human body. When a human body gets to a certain point, and let's say a virus or something like that, or whatever we want to call viruses these days, gets into the body and starts wreaking havoc, it feels metaphorically correct.
I get that.
But yeah, no, so I'm settling into this neighborhood. I'm really enjoying it. I noticed something very strange about this particular neighborhood, which is that when you're driving around, there are no curbs in anybody's lawn, which I thought was very strange. Most neighborhoods that I've lived in over the course of my life have very kind of prominent curbs, this sort of separation between people who are transient and people who live there. And there's something about houses being on the level of the street that feels magically significant to me. I heard once that every time you walk through a doorway, your mind kind of resets, right? So if you have a grocery list in your head. That's why as soon as you walk out the door, it's gone if you didn't write it down,
Uh-huh.
because you're now completely reset. But there's something about that, about the lack of curbs, that I found very fascinating.
That is interesting. Would you call that more of a welcoming, inviting feeling in a neighborhood?
I think so. Yeah, I think so because, from a car's perspective too, you feel more like you are not as shut out. A curb seems to be to keep people obviously from driving onto your lawn,
Right.
which is great. I mean, that's awesome. But I don't think very many people do that in a malicious sense anyway. So when I have guests over, yeah, they can just park on my lawn. It's very Oklahoma.
That is very Oklahoma. Well, it's very a lot of places. I mean, you see that in parts of Vegas, and they're kind of, I don't know. I always feel a sort of level of comfort in those. Some people might think, oh, cars on lawns. Well, I don't want to buy a house there. But actually, oftentimes I've found those people are really cool neighbors. They and they're working on their cars. There's a reason. They're not just parking there for no reason. I think if you start, having like wrecked cars on your lawn, then I'd like to see people out, welding and making art out of them rather than just accumulating them.
My grandmother passed away about 3 years ago, and she left me her car, and it's a 2005 Nissan Altima. I take good care of it. It runs fine, but a day's going to come when it's just gone, and there's something to her spirit in that car. So my grandmother was a very heavy smoker. And when we first got the car, every time my wife would try to get in, the car door would kind of shut on her. And she was having a lot of weird things when she would try to drive it. It would, something would malfunction, or the air conditioner would kick off or whatever. And so I gave her a cigarette, because at the time I was smoking cigarettes. And I said, just take this out to the car and leave it in the dash.
An offering.
And an offering. So she did that. She did exactly that, and never had a problem with the car since. I'm like, yeah, just give something to grandma and you'll be fine. But that is what you said about turning it into art. I couldn't see myself getting rid of this thing. It kind of feels like the last bit of, I have my grandmother's rosary from her first communion, and I have, pictures of her and things like that. But that car, sort of still smells of her and things like that. So I was thinking about using its pieces to make some sort of garden or something like that, like taking the car apart and making a piece of art or a garden or something like that.
Well, that's a great outsider artist magical instinct. I think you should,
Yeah, it's like the materials that you use to make the art are just as important as the finished product itself, Like people used to use red ochre for their bodies and for those early cave paintings and stuff like that. And there's something about that, the red dirt, the red ochre, that's kind of like blood, it's the earth's blood. And I could see the magical significance of, for example, finger painting a successful hunt in the earth's blood. Once again, that feels metaphorically correct.
Well, that I think that goes back to a very ancient idea where metaphor was not some sort of distanced, point of removal from physical reality. It was a direct expression of it. It's really only been historically that we've moved to the idea of, oh, that's only metaphor, What a weird idea, That's not the way that started, It started as a direct magical expression within a certain frame of reference. People didn't, the great Paleolithic cave painters didn't go, well, that's an antelope. Literally, they said that's an antelope magically,
Right. And there's no problem kind of understanding that, the things that you make things out of are very important, and the things that you create, I think it makes me think actually of writing, which is sort of like the business of metaphor, once again, being inextricably tied to magic in its own way. Every time we make a metaphor, we're essentially sort of slipping in and out of that more primal way of thinking that people are used to. You know how sometimes metaphors don't make literal sense, but they when you have an author, you do this a lot, and I love it. An author who's really good, you can't necessarily explain why a metaphor works, but it just feels right. It's like, yeah, that feels correct. You know?
Well, I think that connects to, to the visual arts and to music, where the experience is psychologically and emotionally valid and correct. It doesn't necessarily have to work in a logical, thematic sort of way. It's a much purer and more direct form. And I mean, think of, the outsider artist James Hampton. Yeah, I mean, okay, here's an African American janitor who is unquestionably diagnosable in psychological mental health terms. But imagine the experience of finding the throne of the third heaven in his very, very humble apartment. I mean, he made it out of aluminum foil and salvaged light bulbs. I mean, to me, that would be like looking into, one of the Egyptian pyramids for the first time. People are just blown away, I mean, the sacredness and the intimacy and the personal mythology blending with executional physical art by hand that very few people in art graduate schools are capable of, Amazing. Yeah. Amazing. Yeah. Humbling. Yeah. Humbling.
Yeah. Well, when you look at it, there's an element of like Angkor Wat or something to it when you see it. It's this just very intricate with these kind of spires and angels' wings coming off of it. And apparently also there were pages of text that were found with it. I didn't look too much into those, but apparently there's sort of these religious texts. So this was a guy who had a vision, and if I remember correctly, he was a cook, right? He was a cook who lived in D.C. Is that correct?
Yeah, and he was also a janitor. That's where he got a lot of the stuff. But yeah, I mean, basically very humble, low-level, manual work, Yeah,
and so it kind of goes back to this thing of the people who are given these transmissions. Like, this is a guy who, I didn't know him personally, but I have a hard time believing that he had any sort of personal stake in becoming an artist with a capital A. He was transmuting the metaphors that were in his mind into this piece in his apartment that when it was finished, it was really quite something. Yeah, that's the kind of stuff that I like. It's like art without expectation, right? Again, exploring without expressing. I think that this piece kind of fits that.
It absolutely does. And there is a pattern across these, the individuals that we call outsider artists, and the term I like, which is visionary art. I think that's better than outsider art in a way, because I think it expresses the internal workings of these very eccentric, idiosyncratic, all just absolutely committed artists who were not doing this for any money or recognition, that was the last thing on their minds. They were, there's a wonderful, a Ukrainian Canadian guy named William Kurylik, who created a work called The Maze. And he did it in an asylum, under the worst possible conditions. It makes me think of the Malcolm X piece, A Homemade Education, where he taught himself really to read and write in prison, the worst possible environment. But Kurylik said he was trying to paint the inside of his skull, And a lot of artists would say that, but they would be saying it metaphorically. He meant it quite seriously,
Yes. And there's a I'm looking at it now, there's a fetus right in the middle of it too.
Great.
Which is very interesting. There's like that center that everything sort of like spins around from that. It's almost like a dollhouse looking thing with these different scenes in it. Yeah, that's a fascinating piece of art. I encourage anybody who's listening to this to check that out. But yeah, no, I mean, and it makes me think of, the artists that I know and have known in the past. There was a woman who made stuffed animals, these little stuffed monsters, and she didn't really do much else. I'm not sure I'm sure she survived off of some kind of, welfare or what have you, but she was a very great seamstress, and she would make these little creatures and usually give them away. And there was this time that she was sewing a Batwoman costume for my wife, and I was tasked with going to pick it up. So I went to pick it up, and I go into this woman's apartment, and there's just stuffing everywhere and different pieces of cloth and different monsters in different states of construction. And she's a very small woman with orange hair, and the kind who like shakes while she smokes a cigarette,
Right.
Just like a little cat, like a hairless cat, right? And we're in the apartment and we're shooting the shit back and forth, smoking cigarettes, and the door opened, and this obese white woman in a trench coat, like a Silent Bob trench coat with face tattoos, walks in, and I look at her and I say, I think you are in the wrong apartment. And she looks just as frustrated as we do. And she kind of waves her hand around and she says, well, they told me to come here, so I'm here now. They told me to come here, so now I'm here. And I sort of ushered her out the door and I said, okay, well, thank you for coming, right? But that woman reminds me of the guy who I mentioned in our very first episode, the guy who was in the street. And it kind of makes me wonder, what is it that these people are hearing that's taking them to these different spots, right? They can't explain it either.
Well, that makes me think of, remember My Life in the Bush of Ghosts, which is a great African novel, but it's also the title of a Brian Eno, David Byrne album, which was very, very it's still a great album today. But one of the more sinister but compelling pieces on that, it's an interesting mix of found sound, found voices that they put together. But there's a great line that I really love. It's, we will appear for you from time to time. It's like,
that's great.
Wow.
That's
wow.
great.
That's where promise and threat join hands,
Yeah. Right. Yeah. I wonder, it just makes you kind of think like, was that also a transmission? Was that something that, how much of stuff that you put into a book or stuff that you put into a piece of music, how much is, because we have this thought of, I invented that. I came up with that. It just came, but it doesn't, does it? It comes from somewhere. But I wonder where even is.
Well, that is a magic question. That is a very, no other realm of human endeavor. I mean, science, philosophy, nothing else answers that question. I mean, that's in the magic realm. But your guy in the street, I haven't told you about this. There's this black dude who's, he's obviously homeless, and he's obviously on the schizophrenic spectrum somewhere. And he's recently appeared around the neighborhood. I've seen him like 2 or 3 times. And he looks a little scary. I do admit that. But he's joyful. He's absolutely joyful. And he comes out with these great, strange lines. And his catch cry, if you like, which just makes me laugh, is, and I don't know who he's talking to. He's talking to the world. He's got his own podcast. But his catch cry is, "Come on, man! This is the '90s." And I think some of my, a couple of people, I think, sort of freak out, but I sort of go, well, maybe this is the '90s. Maybe this, maybe we're all wrong, But I kind of dig him. And his other thing, which I think is hilarious, remember, this is in Vegas. He has a cardboard sign, which is kind of a homeless tradition, right? But he's actually got good printing. It kind of looks like he stenciled it almost. And his line is, free advice about gambling addiction. And
Have you ever asked him?
Well, I really want to. I wanted to actually. I feel a little guilty about wanting just to take a photograph without really engaging with him. But I will point out that addiction was correctly spelled, and he has much better printing than I would ever have. And that would be at home with all of the cool art stuff. He's somehow making that happen out on the street. And up until, well, even now, even today, it's been pretty damn hot. And I don't like the idea of being outdoors all the time in that heat. So, here's another one of these people who is kind of at the lowest rung of society and yet is showing some great survival skills and tremendous inner poise. I think real soul. We talk about soul. Well, it's easy to sort of have, be soulful when you're in a recording studio and you've got a lot of cool instruments around you. It's a little bit harder when you're a cappella, out on the street, and maybe you haven't eaten in a couple of days, So next time I see him, I'm going to engage. And I don't know. It's always difficult to know how much help to provide. You got to look at that carefully. And those people are volatile. That's part of the deal. But anyway, just, there are these bodhisattva outsider visionary artists, surviving people that I think you agree we need to sort of have a little bit more respect for,
Yeah, totally. And I think that anybody who thinks that either I or you on this podcast are sort of romanticizing the homeless, I think that that's far from the truth. I've had plenty of run-ins living in Portland with people who were less than savory. I was outside of a bar once and smoking a cigarette yet again. That's how you get into all the trouble with smoking. And Rios was doing a reading in the bar, and I was taking a break. And a guy walked past me talking to himself. He had, an Eminem haircut, right? So the white bleach blonde kind of look. And he sort of throws himself onto the ground in front of me and starts hitting his head on the sidewalk. And then he looks up at me with blood running down his face, and he makes eye contact with me, and he says, "You." And I said, "Oh boy, here we go." I don't know who he's seeing. I don't know who I'm supposed to be right now, but I am somebody who he is not fond of. And so he gets up and he gets in my face, and I'm freaking out a little bit because you don't want to get the blood on you, And then the bouncer for that bar just intervenes, scoops the guy up and tosses him into the street. And the guy stands up and he goes, "You're all a bunch of bullies. You're all bullies." And the bouncer goes, "Yeah, man, I mean, that's why they pay me." And I thought that was a great line.
That is a great line. And listen, I absolutely second your point about, we're not romanticizing these people, or that's not the only approach here. I absolutely agree that, there's a dangerous element, and not all these people are, interesting, creative, cool, funny people. Some of them are, on the streets for reasons, and some of them are really, truly dangerous. Where I used to park at the university when I was teaching, is a real area of homeless people. And I even in the morning, in the bright sunlight, mid-morning, I would be super careful about looking around before I got out of my car, because one day when I was a little bit distracted, this guy he came out of nowhere. He'd been, sleeping behind this dumpster, and he just clocked me. No reason. He didn't try to rob me.
Right.
And as soon as I realized what was going on, he ran off. He didn't want to engage further. But no idea. No explanation. But yeah, no, you can't turn your. Hunter Thompson said you can turn your back, on people sometimes, but you can't turn your back on a drug. And
I like that, yeah.
and these, we're talking about internally synthesized drugs at least, but maybe also who knows what drugs. So yeah, we don't want to romanticize these people, but on the other hand, we don't want to dismiss them either. Just say, well, they're dirty people out in the street, because everyone.
I think that's exactly what we're trying to do. Is that we already know what the kind of status quo belief of these people are, and we're not ignoring that. We're going to stay with that trouble and not dismiss it, but suggest that there's a little bit more to it than just they're icky and gross and should be avoided at all costs. I was thinking about either or stuff earlier, and I was thinking to myself, why is it so hard for people in this day and age to kind of hold conflicting thoughts that they understand are conflicting in their heads, you know? Because I get a lot of heat online from people because I tend to sort of espouse opinions that are not of the current moment. It feels like, especially on social media, you have to sort of follow a script, or you are XYZ, you're this thing or that thing or whatever. And I thought to myself, why do I have sympathy for some of these people who are persona non grata in today's, sort of liberal social scene? And I think it comes from having been addicted to drugs and having a deep kind of period of self-loathing. I don't have self-loathing anymore, but if I could hate, myself that much, but still find enough value in myself to live my life and to, reform and to do all these kind of things, why would I not give that to other people? You know what I mean? Like, I don't understand how people can be this kind of dense about this kind of stuff.
Well, the way I think there's a history, certainly in the Western tradition, which, the Aristotle subject-object dichotomy that has stayed with us and haunted us. Talk about a spirit is haunting Europe. It's haunted us our whole time. But, what do you think about, the 0 and 1 of the digital era? The more connected a civilization or society, let's say, is to digital technology, it seems to me the more either or, cut and dry, my way or the highway sort of thing.
But I love that idea of there being a kind of binary nature to the internet itself, and that fundamental stuff of it somehow can only really create more binaries. That's fascinating.
Well, I think it is really true. And I there's a figure that I know that you admire, Terence McKenna. If listeners are not familiar with Terence McKenna, he was a great writer, but he was a great ethnobotanist and a huge proponent of psychedelics and a great expert on psychedelics. But he was a visionary public intellectual of great humanist value. That the best way I find to connect with him is to hear his voice. There's quite a bit of material available for free on the internet. I personally recommend hearing his lectures live rather than reading his work just on the page, because his voice is wonderfully eccentric, but so articulate. Wouldn't you agree, David?
Oh, 100%. I love the Esalen lectures. And his ability to go in there, as far as I understand it, with no notes and receive questions from the audience and freestyle. He's a freestyle jazz musician, basically, who can just move from topic to topic to topic. He's what I call he's like a systems thinker. He's somebody who's able to put these things together in a way that's really kind of fascinating, which I value so much more than sort of myopic scientism, where somebody will become an expert in, I don't know, microbiology or something. And I would think to myself, okay, that's great. I'll go to you if I have a question about protozoa or something. But what I really value are people who can dabble, who can get the gist of things, can sort of understand things, and then synthesize them together in big ways. Because that's the way we're going to move forward. If you think about it, like, experts they're good worker bees. I would be a terrible worker bee. If I was tasked with working in a lab somewhere to create a vaccine for something, I would not be able to do that. But I would understand, sort of the broad picture of what was going on and could perhaps help in that way. But to get back to Terence, that's what he was so good at. He's famous for saying that that the psilocybin mushroom, is an alien intelligence, which is such a far out, interesting idea that you couldn't get if you were somebody who was, Maybe Paul Stamets would do it, the famous mycologist. But if you're just a mycologist who's just interested in the sort of cataloging of different types of mycelium, you'd never make that connection.
Right, right. Well, he had one of his key theory, I suppose, is that the discovery of psychedelic biological compounds really was the key instigator of human evolution. It really opened the brain, the psychedelic ape idea, which I think is fascinating. But he was also a great hopeful believer in the possible power of the internet and the digital revolution. But he was also deeply concerned that it could resolve itself back to being a reinforcement of binary thinking as opposed to a liberation, from it. And I think that was a really important insight, because he tragically died, when things were really just beginning to get rolling. And I wonder personally what he would think of what's happened today with the internet and social media. He was looking at it so optimistically as really a force for good and for unification, potentially. Not that he was unaware of the possibilities of further division. He was certainly concerned about class and access to, more emergent forms of technology. But that contrast between, the binary restrictive elements of the internet and new technology, say, because all of it's driven by, the 0-1 dichotomy, versus the powerful liberating, qualities. And he related that back to, the psychedelic drug issue, which I think anyone who's had experience with psychedelics can really relate to, that there is, fundamentally, and in world culture terms, they have been treated in very sacred, ceremonial, magical terms. And that's how they work. But when you degrade that, when you take that back to a very secular, mundane, quotidian, or even addictive sort of use, you get immense social problems. You don't get vision, you don't get art, you don't get open experiences of other dimensions of reality. You get criminality, insanity, just hopelessness,
Yeah. Well, I think that is definitely a topic that is so big that we should actually probably pick up with that next time, because I have so many thoughts about what you're saying about, the intentions that you bring to any action, particularly in the psychedelic realm, being so important to actually get something out of a journey. So that's something that I want to talk about. But, I think on Terence's point about, the internet, I think that it could still be utopian if we do something about the social media problem, right? If we break things into smaller message boards like they used to be on the Usenet boards or something like that, where people who were obsessed with the film Terminator 2 could all go and talk about Terminator 2 together and, have their arguments and things like that. What social media has done is basically created a vector for narrative in this society that people either have to conform to or suffer the consequences on both sides, on the left and the right, and in the center. You're a bad libertarian if you don't follow these sort of libertarian ideals. And so it becomes a machine that is constantly discoursing and finding new ways to push people for people to prove their loyalty to the cause, and that's the major problem. We have to stop expressing so much on social media and get back to exploring.
Well, I think the issue that he doesn't quite articulate fully, but I think that you and I have talked about it at various points, is, the issue is access to technology. We've seen that in this, this virus age about, which students have access to technology. And, that expression, well, are you online? Well, I mean, to me, that the problem with that is online has a very rigid, narrow meaning in terms of, well, access to the internet. But you and I have talked about, there must have been a pre-language period of human development, which was virtually sort of telepathic or sort of ceremonial, the dance language of beasts, as James Dickey said. There's a different kind of online. There isn't just one online. I mean, that's a really restrictive. That's not liberating. That's very weird. I mean, yeah, if you get online, you've got access to all sorts of websites, and you can get shoes delivered and your food delivered, and you can get an educational degree. But it's still a channel. It's control of a channel as opposed to an open pirate radio approach to the world. And I was thinking of, when I wrote a book called, Reverend America, and I was going through a lot of personal issues when I wrote that, and I was thinking about my religious upbringing. My father was a minister, at least in the start of my early childhood. So I was thinking about those things. But to go back to our people in the street, your guy in the street, I walked past this guy who I was downtown in a city, and this fellow had constructed this wonderful sort of cyber universal communicating helmet out of stuff he'd found out of a trash can. But my God, it was a beautiful thing. It just looked so cool. And he was talking to, he started off talking to a stockbroker, he was he was doing all this sort of businessman sort of stuff, and then he breaks that off and starts singing. And I'll be damned if he didn't have a beautiful tenor voice. I mean, he was just on key, and it just sounded great. And this actual businessman, who probably had just been talking to his stockbroker, walks past, and in one of the best moments of human connection I've ever seen spontaneously, he starts singing too. And he must have been in the choir. He certainly had some musical training. And they're harmonizing. I mean, here's one guy in, maybe not a $5,000 suit, but a more expensive suit than I've ever worn. And here's a guy who's in some ragged St. Vincent de Paul coat with this crazy helmet earpiece thing he's made, and they're singing together. And that kind of, although I don't mention that in the novel, that was kind of an inciting moment for me, that I thought, that's what really being online might mean. There's a whole bunch of people who will never get online, but maybe they're online in a bigger way. I don't know.
Yeah.
Does that make sense?
I love that. Yeah. And it totally makes sense. And when you think of online, again, I can't help but think of, pieces of dirty laundry on a line,
nice.
Just kind of strung up there, but I think that all the things that we've talked about with the people of the street and stuff like that, and then you brought up Reverend America. Funny story, I have been going to my friend Eric's art space downtown, which is about a 5-minute walk from me. And before I left this town for Portland, I had left a bunch of my books in this art space as a kind of free public library. And one of them was Reverend America, which I would not have done if I had known that it was going to go out of print quite unexpectedly. That surprised me.
Me too.
Yeah, you most of all, for sure. But I think it's one of the books, my favorite is Private Midnight, but I think it's one of the books that captures your speaking voice the best. And so I'd actually like to end the episode with a passage from the very beginning of the novel, if that's all right.
I'd appreciate hearing that.
Okay, so this is from the first chapter, and it's called Now We Are Engaged, which oddly fits with the online thing, doesn't it?
It does indeed.
Seen from a distance, fence stringer gate, battered knapsack, faded jeans, caterpillar cap, close-cropped hair. At close range, a scary white, certainly very white drifter. One who's known the phlegm and dandruff of others, scabies cleanser, sour milk farts of men who haven't changed underwear in a month, buck-toothed women whose yeast infections give off a palpable scent, and worse. Here's a man who's done work you wouldn't last a day doing. Ever pick grapefruit in 110-degree heat? Or punch the charge gun into a pig skull as they come down the concrete chute? Many people know there are towns in Kentucky called Soft Shell, Dwarf, and Monkey's Eyebrow. Some people have been there. A shadow escaped from a body, a Crossroads Man.